The rain hammered against the windows of the small coffee shop near camp as Sarah Martinez sat quietly in the corner booth, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of black coffee. She wore civilian clothes, a simple gray sweater and jeans, her dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. To anyone watching, she looked like just another young woman waiting out the storm. Sarah had been in the military for 15 years, but today she needed a break from the weight of her uniform and everything it represented. She had just returned from a deployment that had tested her in ways she never imagined possible, and the transition back to stateside life felt harder each time. The coffee shop was busier than usual because of the rain. Marines from the nearby base filled most of the tables, their voices mixing with the sound of the storm outside. Sarah recognized some of the faces, but was grateful that none of them seemed to notice her. She cherished these moments of anonymity, where she could just be Sarah instead of Colonel Martinez. She pulled out a small notebook and began writing a letter to the family of one of her fallen soldiers. It was something she did after every deployment, but it never got easier. The words felt inadequate, but she knew the families deserved to hear directly from her about their loved one's service and sacrifice. As she wrote, Sarah became lost in her memories of Sergeant Danny, a young Marine who had shown incredible courage in their final mission. He had saved 3 civilians during an evacuation, giving his own life to ensure they made it to safety. Sarah had recommended him for a posthumous medal, but that felt like such a small gesture compared to what his family had lost. The bell above the coffee shop door chimed as a group of Marines entered, shaking off the rain from their covers and jackets. Sarah glanced up briefly, nodding their youth and energy. They reminded her of herself when she first enlisted, full of determination and eager to prove themselves. One of the Marines, a tall young man with sergeant stripes, was telling a loud story about a training exercise gone wrong. His friends laughed at his exaggerated gestures, and Sarah found herself smiling despite the serious nature of her letter writing. There was something infectious about their enthusiasm. "And then the drill instructor made us crawl through the mud for 2 hours," the sergeant was saying. "I swear my rifle had more dirt in it than the firing range." Sarah remembered her own days in basic training, when everything seemed like the end of the world but was actually just the beginning of something much larger. She had been one of the few women in her unit back then, and she had to work twice as hard to prove she belonged. The military had changed a lot since then, but some challenges remained the same. The group of Marines found a large table near the center of the coffee shop and continued their animated conversation. Sarah tried to focus on her letter, but their energy was distracting. She found herself listening to their stories about their units, their deployments, and their plans for the future. One of the younger Marines, a private first class who couldn't be more than 19, was talking about his girlfriend back home. "I'm going to propose when I get leave next month," he said nervously. "I've been saving up for a ring for almost a year." His friends offered encouragement and advice, some of it helpful and some of it ridiculous. Sarah remembered being that young and thinking she had everything figured out. The truth was, life in the military taught you that nothing ever went according to plan, and the ability to adapt was more valuable than any strategy. She returned to her letter, describing how Sargent had always looked out for the younger Marines in his unit. He had been the kind of leader who led by example, never asking anyone to do something he wouldn't do himself. Sarah had watched him mentor new recruits with the same patience and dedication that her own mentors had shown her years ago. The storm outside seemed to be intensifying, and Sarah wondered if she should wait it out a bit longer before heading back to base. She had meetings scheduled for later in the afternoon, but nothing that couldn't be moved if necessary. Sometimes the rain in Southern California was just an excuse to slow down for a moment. As she continued writing, Sarah reflected on the circular nature of military service. Every generation of Marines learned from the one before it, passing down not just tactics and procedures, but values and traditions. She had been shaped by countless mentors throughout her career, and now she was in a position to shape others. The responsibility was both humbling and daunting. Every decision she made as a commanding officer affected the lives of hundreds of Marines and their families. She took that responsibility seriously, perhaps more seriously than was always healthy for her own well-being. Sarah finished the letter to Sargent's family and carefully folded it. She would have her aide type it up on official letterhead, but she always wrote the first draft by hand. It felt more personal that way, more honest somehow. She glanced around the coffee shop again, watching the Marines at the nearby table. They were discussing their upcoming training schedule, complaining about early morning PT sessions and weekend duty assignments. Sarah remembered having similar conversations when she was their age, never imagining that one day she would be the officer making those schedules. The youngest Marine at the table, a lance corporal with a slight Southern accent, was expressing doubts about re-enlisting when his current contract ended. "I don't know if this life is for me long-term," he said quietly. "It's harder than I thought it would be." His sergeant leaned forward and spoke in a more serious tone. "It's not supposed to be easy, Martinez. That's what makes it worthwhile. When you accomplish something that seemed impossible, that's when you know you're growing." Sarah smiled at the irony of hearing her own last name in this context. She wanted to tell the young lance corporal that doubt was normal, that questioning your path was part of finding your way. But she remained silent, respecting their private conversation while silently hoping the young man would find his answer. The rain continued to pound against the windows, creating a steady rhythm that was almost hypnotic. Sarah ordered another coffee and settled in to wait out the storm. She had nowhere else she needed to be at that exact moment, and these quiet interludes were rare in her life. She thought about her own journey from a young recruit to her current position as colonel. It hadn't been a straight path by any means. There had been moments of doubt, failures that felt devastating at the time, and successes that surprised even her. The military had given her structure and purpose, but it had also demanded sacrifices that she sometimes wondered if she would choose again if given the chance. The group of Marines was preparing to leave as the rain showed signs of letting up. They gathered their covers and jackets, still talking and laughing as they prepared to head back to base. Sarah watched them with a mixture of nostalgia and pride, seeing in them the future of the Corps. As they stood to leave, one of them accidentally bumped into an elderly man who was trying to make his way to a table near the window. The Marine immediately apologized and helped steady the man, making sure he was okay before continuing to the door. It was a small gesture, but it represented the values that the military worked to instill in every service member. Sarah gathered her own things and prepared to leave as well. The storm was beginning to clear, and patches of blue sky were visible through the clouds. She left a generous tip for the waitress and headed toward the door, pulling her jacket tight against the remaining drizzle. As she stepped outside, Sarah felt refreshed in a way that had nothing to do with the cooling rain. Sometimes stepping away from the weight of command and just observing life around her helped put things in perspective. The young Marines in the coffee shop reminded her why she had chosen this career path in the first place, to be part of something larger than herself and to help shape the next generation of leaders. She walked toward her car, already mentally preparing for the afternoon meetings and the decisions that would need to be made. But for just a moment longer, she allowed herself to appreciate the simple pleasure of an ordinary afternoon in an ordinary coffee shop, where she could just be another person seeking shelter from the storm. The drive back to base would give her time to transition back into her role as Colonel Martinez, with all the responsibilities and pressures that came with those oak leaves on her collar. But the brief respite had recharged her spirit and reminded her of the humanity at the heart of military service. Sarah started her car and began the short drive back to camp, the young Marines' voices still echoing in her mind. In a few hours, she would be back in meetings and briefings, making decisions that would affect hundreds of lives. But right now, she was just Sarah, driving through the aftermath of a rainstorm, carrying the stories and hopes of the next generation of Marines with her. 3 weeks later, Sarah found herself standing in the sterile hallway of the Veterans Affairs Hospital in downtown San. She had changed out of her uniform and into civilian clothes again, not wanting to draw attention during what was meant to be a private visit. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she checked the room number written on the small piece of paper in her hand. Room 314. She had been putting off this visit for too long, but today felt right. Today, she had worked up the courage to face one of the hardest parts of her job, visiting Marines who had been wounded in action during her command. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres had been injured in the same mission that claimed Sergeant's life. An improvised explosive device had taken his left leg below the knee and left him with severe burns on his arms and torso. Sarah had visited him twice in the military hospital overseas, but this would be their first meeting since his transfer back to the States. She knocked gently on the door frame and heard a familiar voice call out, "Come in." Sarah stepped into the room to find Tors sitting in a wheelchair by the window, looking out at the city's skyline. His face lit up when he saw her, though she could see the exhaustion in his eyes that hadn't been there before his injury. "Colonel Martinez," he said, attempting to straighten up in his chair. "I wasn't expecting you." "At ease, Tors," Sarah said with a warm smile, pulling up a chair beside him. "I'm not here as your commanding officer today. I'm here as someone who cares about how you're doing." Tors relaxed slightly, though Sarah could see the internal struggle he was having. The warrior mentality didn't easily adapt to accepting help or showing vulnerability, especially in front of a superior officer. She had seen it countless times before. "How are you adjusting to civilian life?" Sarah asked, noting the civilian clothes he wore and the way he kept unconsciously adjusting the prosthetic leg that was visible beneath his jeans. Tors was quiet for a moment, staring out the window again. "It's different," he finally said. "Everything's different. The doctors say I'm making good progress, but some days it doesn't feel that way." Sarah understood the weight behind those words. The transition from active duty to recovery, especially after a traumatic injury, was one of the most challenging experiences any service member could face. The identity shift alone was enormous, going from being defined by physical capability and mission readiness to suddenly having to redefine what strength and purpose meant. "Tell me about the hard days," Sarah said quietly. "What does that look like for you?" Tors glanced at her, surprised by the directness of the question. Most visitors asked about his medical progress or offered generic encouragement. Sarah's willingness to acknowledge the difficult reality of his situation seemed to unlock something in him. "The phantom pain is the worst part," he admitted. "My leg is gone, but my brain doesn't seem to understand that yet. I'll wake up in the middle of the night trying to scratch an itch on a foot that isn't there anymore. The doctors say it's normal, that it might get better with time, but right now it's driving me crazy." Sarah nodded, having heard similar stories from other wounded warriors she had visited over the years. The mind's struggle to adapt to physical changes was often more challenging than the actual medical recovery. "What helps?" she asked. "Keeping busy," Tors said immediately. "When I'm focused on something else, I notice it less. The occupational therapist has me working on all sorts of exercises and activities, and I've been reading a lot, something I never had time for when I was active duty." He gestured to a small stack of books on his bedside table. Sarah could see titles about history, biography, and what looked like a technical manual about prosthetics. Tors had always been curious and intelligent, but military life often left little time for personal intellectual pursuits. "What about the future?" Sarah asked. "Have you given any thought to what comes next?" This question seemed to hit deeper, and Tors was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was more uncertain than she had ever heard it. "That's the hardest part, to be honest. For the last 8 years, my entire identity has been wrapped up in being a Marine. I knew exactly what was expected of me, what my role was, what my capabilities were. Now," he gestured to his leg, "I don't know what I'm capable of anymore." Sarah leaned forward slightly. "Tors, I've known you for 3 years. I've watched you lead Marines in some of the most challenging situations imaginable. Your injury doesn't change the fact that you're intelligent, resourceful, and natural leader. Those qualities don't disappear because of a physical change." "But it's not the same," Tors said, frustration creeping into his voice. "I can't do the job I trained for anymore. I can't lead Marines into combat. I can't even run a simple PT session. What am I supposed to do with all that training and experience if I can't use it in the way I was meant to?" Sarah understood his frustration completely. The military trained its people to be specialists in a very specific type of work, but life often required adaptation to circumstances that couldn't be anticipated. She had seen many Marines struggle with this transition, even those whose separation from service was planned and voluntary. "Can I tell you about something I learned a few years ago?" Sarah asked. Tors nodded, so she continued. "I was working with a Marine who had lost both arms in an explosion. He went through the same identity crisis you're describing. He felt like everything he had trained for was useless." "What happened to him?" Tors asked. "He's now one of the most successful veteran advocates in Washington, D.C. He uses his military experience and his personal understanding of injury recovery to help shape policy for wounded warriors." His combat skills aren't directly applicable to that work, but his leadership experience, his understanding of military culture, and his ability to connect with other veterans make him incredibly effective. Tors considered this, but Sarah could see the skepticism in his expression. That's great for him, but I don't know if I have those kinds of opportunities available to me. Maybe not exactly the same opportunities, Sarah agreed, but you have skills and experiences that translate to civilian life in ways you might not realize yet. Your ability to work under pressure, to make quick decisions, to lead a team through difficult situations, those are valuable in almost any field. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the activity on the street below. Sarah could see Tors processing what she had said, but she also knew that acceptance of a new reality couldn't be rushed. It had to happen on his timeline. "The other Marines in my unit," Tors said eventually. "Do you know how they're doing?" Sarah's expression grew more serious. "Most of them are doing well. Private Johnson got promoted to Lance Corporal last week. Corporal Williams is being considered for sergeant. They ask about you regularly." "And they know about?" Tors gestured to his leg. "They know you were injured," Sarah said carefully. "They know you're recovering, but Tors, they don't think of you any differently. To them, you're still the staff sergeant who had their backs and taught them how to do their jobs correctly." Tors smiled for the first time since Sarah had arrived. Johnson was always getting himself into trouble. Is he still trying to perfect that ridiculous mustache he was growing? Sarah laughed. "Worse than ever. His squad leader has given up trying to talk him out of it." They spent the next hour talking about the Marines in Tor's former unit, sharing stories and updates that helped maintain his connection to the community he had been part of for so long. Sarah could see how much these connections still meant to him, how they provided a sense of continuity even as everything else in his life was changing. As their conversation continued, Sarah noticed a gradual shift in Tor's demeanor. The tension in his shoulders began to ease, and his responses became more animated. Talking about his Marines seemed to remind him of who he was beyond his injury. "Colonel," Tors said as their visit was winding down, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you ever have doubts about the decisions you made during that mission, the one where died and I got hurt?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow, though she tried not to let it show. She had asked herself the same question hundreds of times since that day, analyzing every detail and wondering if different choices might have led to different outcomes. "Every day," she said honestly. "I replay that mission constantly, wondering if there was something I could have done differently, but I've learned that doubt and regret serve different purposes. Doubt helps us learn and improve. Regret just keeps us stuck in the past." Tors nodded slowly. "I don't blame you, for what happened to me or two. We all knew the risks when we signed up for the job." "That doesn't make it easier," Sarah admitted. "Knowing that my decisions put you in harm's way is something I carry with me every day." "But you also made decisions that saved lives," Tors pointed out. "The civilians we evacuated that day are alive because of the choices you made. Died a hero because you gave him the opportunity to be one. And I'm still here, still fighting, because you made sure I got the medical care I needed as quickly as possible." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, though she maintained her composure. Having this conversation with Tors was both healing and painful in ways she hadn't expected. A nurse appeared in the doorway, indicating that visiting hours were ending soon. Sarah stood up and prepared to leave, but Tors reached out and grabbed her hand. "Thank you for coming," he said. "And thank you for being honest with me about the hard stuff. Most people just want to tell me how inspirational I am or how everything happens for a reason. It's nice to talk to someone who understands that this is just really difficult sometimes." Sarah squeezed his hand gently. "You don't have to be inspirational, Tors. You just have to be human. The rest will figure itself out in time." As Sarah left the hospital and walked back to her car, she felt emotionally drained but also oddly lighter. Visiting wounded Marines was one of the hardest parts of her job, but it was also one of the most important. These conversations reminded her why she served and what her responsibilities truly meant. The drive back to base gave her time to process the visit and prepare mentally for the evening's responsibilities. She had dinner plans with her parents, who were visiting from Texas, and she wanted to be fully present for that time with them. But first, she needed to make one more stop. She pulled into the parking lot of a small florist shop and purchased a simple bouquet of white flowers. There was one more visit she needed to make before the day was over. The military cemetery was quiet except for the sound of sprinklers watering the precisely maintained grass. Sarah walked slowly along the rows of white headstones, carrying the bouquet of flowers she had purchased after leaving the hospital. She had been here many times before, but today felt different, more personal somehow. She found Sergeant Danny's grave in Section 7, Row 12. The headstone was simple and dignified, bearing his name, rank, dates of service, and the words loving son and brother. Sarah knelt down and placed the flowers at the base of the stone, taking a moment to arrange them carefully. "Hey, Danny," she said quietly, feeling slightly self-conscious about talking to a gravestone but needing to say the words anyway. "I just visited Torres. He's doing better than I expected, though it's still hard for him. I think you'd be proud of how he's handling everything." The evening air was cool and carried the scent of the ocean, which was only a few miles away. Sarah had grown to love this about Southern California, the way the military bases were woven into communities that had their own rhythms and traditions. It made the service feel more connected to the civilian world they were sworn to protect. "I know you'd probably tell me to stop coming here," Sarah continued, settling more comfortably on the grass beside the grave. "You were always more focused on the living than the dead, but I need this sometimes. I need to remember why we do what we do." She thought about the letter she had finally sent to the family 2 weeks ago. His mother had called her personally to thank her, and they had talked for over an hour about Danny's childhood, his dreams, and his dedication to his fellow Marines. It had been both heartbreaking and healing to hear stories about the man behind the uniform. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from her aide, reminding her about the change of command ceremony scheduled for the following week. A fellow colonel was retiring after 26 years of service, and Sarah would be taking over his responsibilities in addition to her current duties. It was a promotion in all but official rank, and it would mean even more Marines under her command. The weight of that responsibility felt heavier here, surrounded by the graves of those who had made the ultimate sacrifice. Each headstone represented not just a life lost, but families forever changed, potential unfulfilled, and dreams cut short. Sarah knew that every decision she made as a commander could potentially add more names to places like this. "I got the promotion I've been working toward," she told Danny's grave. "More responsibility, more Marines to look after. I know you'd congratulate me, but you'd also remind me not to let it go to my head." She smiled, remembering how Danny had always been respectful but never intimidated by rank. He had a way of treating everyone with the same fundamental dignity, whether they were a private fresh out of boot camp or a general visiting from headquarters. It was one of the qualities that had made him such an effective leader among his peers. A groundskeeper working nearby waved politely as he moved his equipment to a different section of the cemetery. Sarah waved back, appreciating his discretion in giving her space for this private moment. The staff here understood the importance of these visits for the families and fellow service members who came to pay their respects. Sarah's thoughts drifted to her parents, who would be arriving at the restaurant soon for dinner. They had never fully understood her choice to join the military, especially her mother, who worried constantly about her safety and well-being. Tonight's dinner would likely include gentle suggestions about considering a civilian career or questions about when she might think about settling down and starting a family. These conversations had become more frequent as Sarah advanced in rank and age. Her parents weren't wrong to worry. The demands of military leadership left little time for personal relationships, and the stress of command could be isolating. But they also didn't understand how much purpose and fulfillment she found in her work. "Your family understands, though," Sarah said to the headstone. "I could hear it in your mother's voice when we talked. She's proud of what you accomplished, even though she wishes you were still here. That's the balance all military families have to find." The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the cemetery. Sarah knew she should leave soon to meet her parents, but she wasn't quite ready to transition back into daughter mode after the emotional weight of the day's visits. Her phone rang, and she saw her aide's number on the screen. Sarah considered letting it go to voicemail, but duty called. "Colonel Martinez," she answered. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to bother you, but we've received word that one of our Marines was involved in an incident downtown. The local police are requesting that a commanding officer respond to the scene." Sarah's stomach dropped, What kind of incident? Apparently, there was an altercation at a bar near the base. Marine Corps MPs are en route, but the civilian authorities want someone from the chain of command present. Which Marine? Sarah asked, already standing and walking back toward her car. Lance Corporal, ma'am. He's assigned to Bravo Company. Sarah recognized the name immediately. Was one of the younger Marines who had been struggling with the transition back from deployment. His squad leader had mentioned concerns about his drinking and his tendency to get into arguments when he'd had too much alcohol. I'll be there in 20 minutes, Sarah said. Send me the address and make sure someone contacts his immediate chain of command. As Sarah drove toward downtown, she called her parents to explain that dinner would have to be postponed. Her mother's disappointed sigh was audible through the phone, but her father, who had served briefly in the Navy decades ago, understood the unpredictable nature of military responsibilities. The bar was in a part of town that catered to the military crowd, nothing fancy, but clean and reasonably priced. Sarah could see the flashing lights of police cars as she approached the scene. She parked and walked toward the cluster of officers and Marines gathered near the entrance. Lance Corporal was sitting in the back of a police cruiser, his uniform disheveled and his face showing signs of having been in a fight. Sarah could see the shame and anger in his expression as she approached the senior police officer. I'm Colonel Martinez, she introduced herself. I understand one of my Marines is involved in this situation. The police officer, a sergeant with graying hair and tired eyes, shook her hand. Your boy got into it with some civilians over something stupid. No one was seriously hurt, but there was property damage and disturbing the peace. The bar owner is willing not to press charges if the Marine Corps handles this internally. Sarah nodded, appreciating the officer's willingness to work with the military rather than pursuing civilian charges. What exactly happened? Near as we can tell, some guys were making comments about military personnel, nothing too serious, but your Marine took it personally. Words escalated to pushing, then to a full brawl. 3 civilian injuries, all minor, and a broken table. Sarah looked toward the police car where sat. She could see the internal struggle on his face, the knowledge that he had let down his unit and his training, mixed with whatever frustration or pain had led him to this point in the first place. Can I speak with him? Of course, ma'am. Sarah walked over to the police car and asked the officer to step aside for a moment. She opened the door and sat on the edge of the seat, facing. Lance Corporal, she said quietly, look at me. Reluctantly raised his eyes to meet hers. She could see the alcohol on his breath and the confusion in his expression. What happened here tonight? Was quiet for a long moment, then spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. They said Marines were just killers, that we didn't belong in civilized society. I know I should have walked away, but I couldn't. Sarah understood the trigger. Coming back from deployment, especially from combat zones, often left Marines feeling disconnected from civilian society. When that disconnection was reinforced by negative comments from civilians, it could lead to exactly this kind of situation. How much have you had to drink tonight? Too much, admitted. I've been drinking too much every night since we got back. I know that's not an excuse. No, it's not an excuse, Sarah agreed. But it might be an explanation. When's the last time you talked to someone about how you're adjusting to being back? Shrugged, everyone keeps asking if I'm okay. I keep saying yes because that's what you're supposed to say. Sarah recognized the pattern. Many Marines struggled with admitting they needed help, seeing it as a sign of weakness rather than a normal part of processing difficult experiences. I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need an honest answer. Are you okay? This time didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked slightly. No, ma'am, I don't think I am. The admission hung in the air between them. Sarah could see the relief in face at finally saying the truth out loud, mixed with fear about what might happen next. That's the first step, Sarah said. Admitting you need help isn't weakness, it's courage, and it's what's going to keep you from ending up in situations like this again. She spent the next 20 minutes working with the police officers and the bar owner to resolve the immediate situation. Would face military discipline for his actions, but the civilian charges would be dropped. More importantly, Sarah arranged for him to begin working with a counselor who specialized in deployment-related stress. As the police released into military custody, Sarah drove him back to base personally rather than having the MPs transport him. The drive gave them a chance to talk more about what he was experiencing and what resources were available to help him. "Colonel," said as they neared the base, "why are you doing this? I screwed up. I embarrassed the Corps. Most officers would just throw the book at me and move on." Sarah considered her answer carefully. "Because I've been where you are, maybe not exactly the same situation, but I've struggled with the weight of what we do and what we see, and because Sergeant would have done the same thing for you." The mention of name seemed to hit hard. He had served in Danny's squad during their deployment and had been deeply affected by his death. "He always said we look out for each other," said quietly. "That's right, and looking out for each other means getting help when we need it, not pretending we're fine when we're not." As they arrived at the base, Sarah made arrangements for to check in with his squad leader and begin the process of getting the support he needed. It would be a long road back for him, but Sarah was confident he could make it with the right help and supervision. The incident reminded Sarah why her work mattered beyond the strategic and tactical aspects of military command. Every Marine under her leadership was a person with their own struggles, their own pain, and their own potential. Her job was to help them realize that potential while keeping them safe and mission-ready. By the time Sarah finally made it home, it was nearly midnight. Her parents had long since returned to their hotel, and dinner would have to wait for another day. But as she sat in her apartment, still processing the events of the day, visiting tours, talking to Danny's grave, helping, she felt a deep sense of purpose. This was why she served. Not for the promotions or the recognition, but for the privilege of leading Marines through the most challenging experiences of their lives and helping them emerge stronger on the other side. 2 months after the incident with Lance Corporal, Sarah found herself in civilian clothes again, this time at a community event in downtown San. The annual Veterans Day Festival was in full swing, with food trucks, live music, and booths representing various military and veteran organizations. Sarah had been invited to speak at the event, but she preferred to arrive early and walk around anonymously for a while before her scheduled appearance. The festival was larger than she had expected, with hundreds of families enjoying the sunny afternoon. Children ran between the booths while their parents browsed displays of military history and veteran services. Sarah appreciated events like this because they helped bridge the gap between military and civilian communities, fostering understanding and appreciation on both sides. She stopped at a booth run by a local organization that provided support services for wounded veterans. The volunteer staffing the booth was a young woman who looked to be in her early 30s, with an enthusiasm that seemed genuine rather than performative. "Are you interested in learning about our programs?" the volunteer asked as Sarah approached. "Actually, I'm familiar with your organization," Sarah replied. "You do excellent work. I've referred several Marines to your services over the years." The volunteer's face lit up. "That's wonderful to hear. Are you military yourself?" "I am," Sarah said simply, not elaborating on her rank or position. She enjoyed these conversations where she could just be someone who served rather than someone who commanded. They chatted for several minutes about the challenges facing veterans as they transitioned to civilian life. The volunteer shared stories about success cases, veterans who had found new careers, started families, or discovered purposes they never knew existed. Sarah found these stories hopeful and uplifting after dealing with so many of the difficult cases that crossed her desk as a commanding officer. As Sarah continued walking through the festival, she noticed a commotion near one of the food trucks. A small crowd had gathered around what appeared to be some kind of disagreement. Sarah moved closer to see what was happening, her training making her instinctively assess whether intervention might be needed. She could see 3 young men in their early 20s arguing loudly with an older veteran who was wearing a Vietnam War cap. The younger men appeared to have been drinking, despite the early hour, and their voices were getting increasingly aggressive. "You old-timers had it easy," one of them was saying. "You got parades when you came home. We don't get anything but people telling us we're broken." Sarah immediately recognized the type of confrontation this could become. Generational tensions between veterans were not uncommon, especially when alcohol was involved and when younger veterans were struggling with their own adjustment issues. The Vietnam veteran, a man who looked to be in his 70s, was trying to remain calm but was clearly getting frustrated. "Son, I don't know what you think you know about Vietnam, but— Don't call me son, the younger man interrupted, stepping closer aggressively. I did 3 tours in Afghanistan. I've earned the right to have an opinion. Sarah could see that the situation was escalating quickly. The crowd around them was growing, and she noticed several people pulling out phones to record what might become a physical altercation. She also noticed that the 3 younger men all had haircuts and bearing that suggested they were likely active-duty military. Without thinking about the fact that she was in civilian clothes and had no official authority in this setting, Sarah stepped forward into the circle. She said in a calm but authoritative voice that immediately drew everyone's attention, "This isn't the time or place for this conversation." The young man who had been doing most of the talking turned toward her with obvious irritation. "This doesn't concern you, lady. Why don't you mind your own business?" Sarah could see recognition dawn in the faces of some of the other people in the crowd. They could tell from her bearing and the way she had inserted herself into the situation that she was likely military. But the 3 young men were too focused on their anger to notice these subtle cues. "Actually, it does concern me," Sarah said evenly, "especially when Marines are representing the Corps poorly in public." The word Marines seemed to snap the young men to attention, and Sarah could see them reassessing her. They were definitely Marines themselves. She could tell from their reaction and their overall appearance. "How do you know we're Marines?" the leader of the group asked, his tone becoming slightly more respectful but still defiant. "The same way I know you're all going to regret this conversation tomorrow morning," Sarah replied. "And the same way I know that you're dishonoring every Marine who came before you by disrespecting this veteran." The Vietnam veteran looked at Sarah with gratitude and curiosity. He had clearly recognized that she was military as well, but like everyone else, he had no idea what rank she might hold. "Ma'am," one of the other young Marines spoke up, "we're off duty and off base. We have the right to express our opinions." "You absolutely do," Sarah agreed, "but not in a way that creates a scene and reflects poorly on the Marine Corps, and not by attacking a fellow veteran who served his country with honor." The lead Marine, who Sarah now noticed was wearing a shirt that suggested he was a sergeant, seemed to be weighing his options. She could see the alcohol impairing his judgment, but she could also see his military training telling him that he might be in over his head. "Who are you to tell us how to behave?" he asked, taking a step closer to Sarah in what was clearly meant to be an intimidating gesture. This was the moment that would change everything, though none of them knew it yet. Sarah remained perfectly still as the sergeant stepped into her personal space, clearly trying to intimidate her into backing down. "I'm someone who cares about the reputation of the Corps and the welfare of Marines," she said calmly. "And I'm someone who's asking you to show proper respect for a veteran and for the event we're all attending." The sergeant's face was flushed with anger and alcohol. Without warning, he reached out and shoved Sarah hard in the shoulder, causing her to step back slightly but not fall. "Get out of here before you get hurt," he snarled. The crowd around them gasped, and Sarah heard several people starting to call for security or police. But what happened next surprised everyone. Instead of escalating the situation or backing down, Sarah simply straightened her shoulders and looked directly at the sergeant who had shoved her. "Sergeant," she said in a voice that was quiet but carried absolute authority, "you have just made the worst mistake of your military career." Something in her tone caused all 3 young Marines to freeze. The crowd around them went silent, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "Ma'am," the sergeant said, and for the first time Sarah could hear uncertainty in his voice. "What's your name, Sergeant?" Sarah asked. The Marines exchanged glances, and Sarah could see them beginning to realize that they might have seriously misjudged the situation. "Sergeant Jason, ma'am," the leader finally said, his voice now much more respectful. "Unit, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, ma'am." Sarah nodded slowly. She knew that unit well. They were currently under her command as part of the restructuring that had taken place the month before. "Sergeant," Sarah said clearly, loud enough for the crowd to hear, "I am Colonel Sarah Martinez, your commanding officer. You and your Marines will report to my office at 800 tomorrow morning in full dress blues." The effect of this revelation was immediate and dramatic. The 3 Marines snapped to attention so quickly that one of them nearly lost his balance. The crowd around them murmured in amazement, and several people began applauding. Ma'am, Sergeant said, his face now completely pale. We didn't know. No, you didn't know, Sarah agreed. But that's not an excuse for your behavior. You disrespected a fellow veteran, you created a scene at a community event designed to honor military service, and you put your hands on a superior officer. The Vietnam veteran, who had been watching this exchange with growing amazement, stepped forward. Colonel, he said with a broad smile, I think these boys just learned a lesson they won't soon forget. Sarah turned to the older veteran and extended her hand. I'm sorry about their behavior, sir. They don't represent the values of the Marine Corps. They're young, the veteran replied kindly. We all made mistakes at that age. The important thing is that they learn from this. The crowd was beginning to disperse, but Sarah could see many people taking pictures and videos of the aftermath. She knew that this incident would likely become a story that circulated around the base and possibly beyond. Sergeant, Sarah said, turning back to the three Marines, you and your Marines are going to apologize to this gentleman, and then you're going to leave this event immediately. You will not consume any more alcohol today, and you will spend the rest of your weekend thinking about how you want to represent the Corps going forward. Yes, ma'am, all three Marines said in unison. They each apologized to the Vietnam veteran, who accepted their apologies graciously and even shook their hands. Sarah could see the shame in their faces as they realized how badly they had behaved. As the three Marines prepared to leave, Sergeant approached Sarah one more time. Colonel, he said quietly, I know there's nothing I can say to excuse what just happened. I take full responsibility for my actions and for my Marines. That's a start, Sergeant, Sarah replied. But words are easy. What matters is what you do going forward. You have the potential to be a good leader, but leadership means controlling yourself first before you can lead others. Yes, ma'am, I understand. After the Marines left, Sarah spent a few more minutes talking with the Vietnam veteran, whose name was Harold. He had served 2 tours in Vietnam and had spent the decades since working as a high school teacher and coach. That was beautifully handled, he told Sarah. You could have humiliated them in front of everyone, but you gave them a chance to maintain some dignity while still making your point. They're good Marines who made bad choices, Sarah replied. Everyone deserves a chance to learn from their mistakes. As Sarah continued through the festival, word of the incident spread quickly among the other military personnel in attendance. Several people approached her to comment on how she had handled the situation, and she found herself becoming the unofficial center of attention in a way she hadn't intended. When it came time for her scheduled speech, Sarah decided to use the morning's events as a teaching moment. She spoke about the importance of representing military values in all circumstances, the responsibility that comes with wearing the uniform, even metaphorically, and the bonds that should connect all generations of veterans. Her speech was well received, but Sarah was eager to leave the festival and process what had happened. The incident with Sergeant and his Marines would require follow-up beyond the meeting she had scheduled for Monday morning. As she drove home, Sarah reflected on the irony of the situation. She had come to the festival to speak about military values and the importance of veteran community, and instead found herself living those values in a very public and unexpected way. The afternoon had reminded her that leadership wasn't just about giving orders or making strategic decisions. Sometimes it was about having the courage to step forward when something was wrong and the wisdom to handle confrontation in a way that taught rather than just punished. Sarah knew that Monday morning's meeting with Sergeant and his Marines would be crucial in determining whether they learned from this experience or simply resented it. Her goal would be to help them understand not just what they had done wrong, but why it mattered and how they could do better in the future. Monday morning arrived gray and overcast, with a marine layer hanging low over camp. Sarah arrived at her office earlier than usual, wanting to prepare for what she knew would be a difficult but important conversation with Sergeant and his Marines. She had spent much of Sunday thinking about how to approach the meeting in a way that would be both corrective and constructive. At exactly 800, her aide announced that the 3 Marines were waiting outside. Sarah took a deep breath and told him to send them in. The door opened to reveal Sergeant, Lance Corporal, and Private First Class, all in immaculate dress blue uniforms, standing at perfect attention. Have a seat, Sarah said, gesturing to the chairs arranged in front of her desk. The formality of the dress blues and the office setting was intentional. She wanted them to understand the seriousness of what had occurred while also creating an environment where honest conversation could take place. The three Marines sat down but remained rigidly upright, their eyes fixed straight ahead. Sarah could see the tension in their faces and the shame that had clearly been building over the weekend. "Before we discuss what happened at the festival," Sarah began, "I want each of you to tell me about your military service. Start with you, Sergeant." Seemed surprised by the question but responded immediately. "I enlisted 4 years ago, ma'am. 2 deployments to Afghanistan, most recently with 2nd Battalion. I was promoted to sergeant 8 months ago." "And your time in the Corps, how would you describe it?" "It's been the most important thing in my life, ma'am. The Marines gave me structure and purpose I never had before. I'm proud to serve." Sarah nodded and turned to the others. Lance Corporal spoke about growing up in a military family and wanting to continue that tradition. Private First Class, the youngest of the group, talked about joining the Marines to pay for college but discovering a sense of belonging he hadn't expected. As Sarah listened to their stories, she was reminded that these were fundamentally good Marines who had made serious errors in judgment. Their service records, which she had reviewed over the weekend, showed dedication and competence in their duties. "Now," Sarah said, "tell me what happened on Saturday from your perspective, Sergeant." Straightened even further if that was possible. "Ma'am, we had been at the festival for about an hour. We'd been drinking, which was our first mistake. We got into a conversation with the Vietnam veteran that escalated when I let my personal feelings about veteran treatment get in the way of military courtesy." "What personal feelings?" Hesitated, then continued. "Ma'am, I've been struggling with some issues since my last deployment. I've been frustrated with how little support veterans seem to get compared to previous generations. I know that's not an excuse, but it's what was going through my head." Sarah recognized the underlying issue immediately. Was dealing with his own adjustment problems and had directed that frustration outward rather than seeking appropriate help. "Continue." "When you intervened, I was already angry and not thinking clearly. When you challenged us, I saw it as another person trying to tell us what to do without understanding what we'd been through. I reacted emotionally instead of logically. And when you put your hands on me." His face flushed with shame. "Ma'am, there's no excuse for that. I violated everything I was taught about respect, military bearing, and proper conduct. I embarrassed the Corps and myself." Sarah turned to the other 2 Marines. "Do you agree with Sergeant's assessment?" Both nodded emphatically. Lance Corporal spoke up. "Ma'am, we should have stopped it from escalating. We followed Sergeant's lead instead of thinking for ourselves about what was right." "That's an important observation, Lance Corporal. What do you think you should have done differently?" "We should have walked away when the conversation with the Vietnam veteran started getting heated. We should have stopped drinking earlier in the day. And when you tried to defuse the situation, we should have listened instead of getting defensive." Sarah spent the next hour talking with them about leadership, responsibility, and the weight that came with wearing the Marine uniform, even when off duty. She could see that all 3 Marines were genuinely remorseful and were beginning to understand the broader implications of their actions. "Sergeant," Sarah said finally, "what do you think should happen as a result of Saturday's incident?" Had clearly been thinking about this question all weekend. "Ma'am, I think we should all be reduced in rank and face disciplinary action. I should probably be discharged for putting hands on a superior officer." "That's one possible outcome," Sarah agreed. "But before I make any decisions about your futures, I want to understand something. Are you getting help for the issues you mentioned? The frustration and adjustment problems?" Looked uncomfortable. "No, ma'am, I've been trying to handle it on my own." "And how's that working out for you?" "Not well, ma'am." Sarah leaned back in her chair. "Here's what's going to happen. All 3 of you are going to begin counseling with our support services, not as punishment, but as Marines who need help processing difficult experiences. This is non-negotiable." She could see relief beginning to replace some of the tension in their faces. "Additionally, you're all going to spend your next 4 weekends doing community service with veteran organizations in San. You'll learn about the challenges facing all generations of veterans and hopefully gain some perspective on the bigger picture." "Yes, ma'am," they said in unison. "Sergeant, you're going to write a personal letter to Mr. the Vietnam veteran from Saturday, apologizing for your behavior and thanking him for his service. All three of you will attend the next Gold Star Families event at the base, where you'll serve as volunteers and learn about the ultimate sacrifice some families have made. Sarah paused, watching their reactions. She could see that they were processing the fact that she wasn't destroying their careers, but instead giving them an opportunity to learn and grow. Now about the assault on a superior officer, Sarah continued, and she saw tense up again. Sergeant, what you did was serious and could result in severe disciplinary action. However, I believe that the best leaders are often those who have learned from significant mistakes. Looked confused, not sure where this was heading. You're not going to be discharged. You're not going to be reduced in rank, but you are going to be transferred to work directly for me for the next 6 months. You'll serve as my liaison with junior Marines who are struggling with deployment-related issues. Your job will be to identify Marines who need help and connect them with appropriate resources. The change in expression was dramatic. Ma'am, I don't understand. Why aren't you throwing the book at me? Sarah stood up and walked around her desk to face the 3 Marines. Because Sergeant taught me something important before he died. He said that the measure of a leader isn't whether their Marines make mistakes, but whether they learn from those mistakes and become better as a result. The mention of his name seemed to hit all 3 Marines hard. They had all known him and respected him greatly. Danny was the kind of Marine who would have seen potential in you even after Saturday's incident. He would have found a way to help you channel your frustration into something positive. That's what I'm trying to do. Sarah sat back down and looked at each Marine individually. But understand this, you're getting one chance, one opportunity to prove that Saturday was an aberration and not a pattern. If you waste this chance, there won't be another one. We won't waste it, ma'am, said, and Sarah could hear the conviction in his voice. The meeting concluded with specific instructions about their new assignments and responsibilities. As the Marines prepared to leave, asked if he could speak with Sarah privately for a moment. After the other 2 Marines left, remained standing at attention in front of Sarah's desk. Ma'am, I need you to know that I understand what you're doing for me, for all of us. Most officers wouldn't have given us this opportunity. Most officers wouldn't have been shoved by a drunk sergeant at a public event either, Sarah replied with a slight smile. Ma'am, can I ask you something? When I pushed you on Saturday, you didn't flinch, you didn't get angry. How did you stay so calm? Sarah thought about the question for a moment. Sergeant, in my 15 years in the Corps, I've faced combat situations, hostile negotiations, and life-or-death decisions. A drunk Marine having a bad day doesn't register as a real threat. But more importantly, I could see that you weren't really angry at me. You were angry at a situation you felt powerless to change. Nodded slowly. That's exactly right, ma'am. I felt like I had no control over anything that was happening to me or to other Marines like me. The irony is that you do have control, Sarah pointed out. You have the power to get help when you need it, to support other Marines who are struggling, and to represent the Corps with honor. You just forgot that for a while. Over the following weeks, Sarah watched Sergeant's transformation with interest and pride. His new role as liaison to struggling Marines seemed to give him the sense of purpose he had been missing. He threw himself into the work with dedication, and Sarah began receiving positive reports from the counseling staff about his progress. Lance Corporal and Private First Class also embraced their community service assignments, and Sarah could see them developing a broader understanding of veteran issues and military service. The incident at the Veterans Day Festival became something of a legend around the base, though not in the way Sarah had expected. Instead of being remembered as a disciplinary disaster, it became a story about second chances and the importance of looking out for fellow Marines. 3 months after that gray Monday morning meeting, Sergeant knocked on Sarah's office door with his monthly report on Marines who had been connected with support services. 14 Marines referred to counseling this month, he reported. 12 are showing significant improvement. 2 are still in the early stages of treatment. And you, Sarah asked. Better every day, ma'am. The work helps. Knowing that I can prevent other Marines from going through what I went through gives me purpose. Sarah nodded approvingly. What about your own counseling? Still going twice a week. I understand now that getting help isn't weakness. It's like maintenance on a weapon. You do it to keep everything functioning properly. As left her office, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that confrontational afternoon at the festival. What could have been a career-ending incident for three Marines had instead become a catalyst for growth and positive change. She thought about Sargent and what he would think of how things had turned out. Danny had always believed that every Marine deserved a chance to succeed, and that the job of leaders was to help create those opportunities for success. The phone on Sarah's desk rang, and her aide informed her that she had a call from Mr., the Vietnam veteran from the festival. Sarah smiled as she picked up the phone. "Colonel Martinez," she answered. "Colonel, this is Harold. I wanted to call and thank you again for how you handled that situation at the festival. But more than that, I wanted you to know that I received the most thoughtful letter from that young sergeant. He asked if he could meet with me to learn more about veteran issues, and we ended up talking for 3 hours." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest. "I'm glad to hear that, mister. That boy has real potential as a leader. I can see why you gave him a second chance. Sometimes the best leaders are the ones who made significant mistakes and learned from them." After the call ended, Sarah sat back in her chair and looked out her office window at the Marines training on the grounds outside. Each of those Marines had their own story, their own struggles, and their own potential for greatness. Her job was to help them realize that potential, even when they couldn't see it themselves. The incident that had started with a shove in front of a crowd of strangers had evolved into a lesson about leadership, redemption, and the bonds that connected all Marines across generations. It reminded Sarah why she had chosen this career, and why, despite all its challenges, she couldn't imagine doing anything else. In a few months, Sargent would complete his 6-month assignment working directly for her, and he would return to regular duties as a squad leader. But Sarah knew that the lessons he had learned during this time would stay with him throughout his career. And somewhere down the line, he would likely pass those lessons on to other Marines who needed second chances of their own. This was how the Marine Corps really worked, not through perfect execution and flawless performance, but through the messy, human process of making mistakes, learning from them, and becoming stronger as a result. It was a tradition that connected every Marine who had ever worn the uniform, from the recruit to the most senior officer. And sometimes, it all started with someone caring enough to step forward when they saw something wrong, even when they were wearing civilian clothes at a veterans' festival on a Saturday afternoon.